Okay, well, Paul is now under the jurisdiction of Festus. Felix has left, and he has been accused by the Jews again, and so far Festus has found nothing to condemn him for, but in order to do a favor for the Jews, which seems to be a common thread off and on, he asked the Apostle Paul if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem to face judgment, and as a result, the Apostle Paul says he's being judged where he should be judged at that point in time, and then he appealed to Caesar. And so Festus was obligated to grant that appeal, and after he had spoken with the council to let them know what was going on, he said, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." And so that is eventually where the Apostle Paul is going to end up as we go through the book of Acts. But right now we're going to pick up in chapter 25, verse 13. Chapter 25, verse 13. After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face, and has an opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Okay, so we'll pause there for just a few moments. So, King Agrippa has now come to visit to pay his respects to Festus as being the new governor of the region. And in the process, Festus is informing him of everything that's happened under Felix and now what has been kind of dropped into his lap, so to speak. And he is basically reinforcing the idea that he is trying to follow the Roman law. I've done this, and here's what I've done. And when I came to Jerusalem, the Jews were making accusations. So the next day, once I got here in Caesarea, we had the trial. And then I asked him if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem. What he does not point out is that he asked him to go to Jerusalem because he was trying to grant the Jews a favor. Notice how these guys seem to dodge all of the facts. Okay, they just the ones that make them look good are the ones that they present, which we've talked about how common that is. But at the same time, Scripture is showing us what really happened as opposed to what Festus is saying. And so Festus is filling Agrippa in as to what's going on, and so. And he basically said, I didn't delay it, I didn't drag it out or anything. Because after all, Paul's been there for what? 2 years now. And so he's made this a quick thing. And he's even admitted that he couldn't find anything that was of any substance to the accusations. And so even though he's not actually telling Agrippa that he was trying to do a favor for the Jews, the fact that he admitted that there was no basis for the accusations and then asked him if he would go to Jerusalem and stay in trial, without realizing what he's done, he's actually admitted he is offering a favor to the Jews. And he's exposing basically his political motives and how he's handling things. But the interesting thing is that we've got Agrippa coming into the picture. And Agrippa is kind of a rather important figure in this situation, which we'll look at in just a little bit. But we find also what is going on is the fact that this has just been dropped into Festus's lap, and he's trying to figure out what in the world he's going to tell Augustus when he sends Paul to Rome. I mean, we had that situation before when Paul was sent to Felix. Lysias, the commander, had to put together a letter to explain why he was sending this man, Paul, to him and what had been going on. Of course, we saw that Lysias left a lot of the details out as well. But it is that same idea that you don't just send someone, say, this guy's a prisoner, he's wanting your judgment. You fill the person, you fill whoever's going to be sitting in judgment, you fill them in on what's been going on. And it kind of puts you in a rough spot. Festus is in a rough spot now because he's already determined that there's no basis for the accusations, but the Apostle Paul has appealed to Caesar, taking it out of his hands. So how do you explain to Caesar why you're sending this man as a prisoner when you have already determined that there's no reason for him to be a prisoner? Kind of an interesting situation to be in, isn't it? Because, I mean, he openly admits, questions against him about their own religion. And it's been ascertained there's no reason for him to be a prisoner. And so Festus is looking to get some insight from King Agrippa. And so after telling King Agrippa that, this is what's going on, and I'm sure much to the delight of Festus, Agrippa says, I'd like to talk to him too. I'd like to hear this man speak. And so Festus tells him, okay, we'll do it tomorrow. Which brings us to verse 23. Are there any questions, comments before we move on into this? Okay. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. So, stop there. So Festus is admitting, I'm stuck here. It's already determined. He's got no reason for being here, but now I have to send him to Caesar. And notice how everything is done in such a flattering way. We talked about how they had a tendency to flatter each other. And we see that Agrippa came in with all the pomp and pageantry and everything. And now Festus is flattering him in front of everyone else, playing the political games. As he is reaching out to Agrippa, now putting Agrippa in the hot seat, you might say. So he's kind of passing the buck. Agrippa says, well, I like to hear him myself. And Festus says, tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and he brings in Paul. He says, okay, here, King, here's my situation. I've already found that he's not worthy of being in prison or death or anything, so he's appealed to Caesar. What do I say? In other words, it's in your court now, Agrippa. Give me some insight. Tell me what to say. As he leans on Agrippa to give him some guidance. And so we've got the stage set as Paul is going to prepare to make a defense before Agrippa, which, as we already know, is not really, many of the Bible headings will say, Paul makes his defense, but it's already been determined. He's not defending himself anymore. He's just simply proclaiming the gospel. Because they've already determined he's innocent. So, a man who's been determined innocent doesn't have to defend himself. And so that's the situation we've got as the stage is now set for Agrippa to hear the gospel message. And we will pick up then as we slide into chapter 26. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered him for himself. "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are expert in all the customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently." Okay, let's pause there for just a moment. Notice what's happening. The Jews were not informed that he's going to be standing before Agrippa. Have you noticed that? The Jews were there when he's before Felix. The Jews were there when they was before just Festus. But the Jews have not been invited to this round. They're not there. And notice what the Apostle Paul is making very clear. He's happy that he's speaking to King Agrippa because this king is familiar with these things. Okay? He has an understanding of what's being talked about. There is some kind of connection there that is very important, even to the extent that there is some allusion down through here that King Agrippa may have some Jewish heritage, as we'll look as we go through this. And so that would explain why he is an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. He's got the heritage. He's got the connection there. And so the Apostle Paul especially wants his attention. Because in his mind, if anybody's going to really understand and truly grasp what he's talking about, it's going to be King Agrippa. Because of his heritage background. And so it is in what we're about to look at, the Apostle Paul is not going to just talk about the events that had him there. He's going to give King Agrippa a life background. He's going to give King Agrippa a real quick synopsis of his life. And so let's pick up in verse 4. "My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify, that according to the strictest sect of our religion I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. To this promise our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead?" Now let's stop there for a moment. He's just given us a lot of information here. All right? It says, "And the manner of my life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem." We refer to Saul when he was before he was called Paul as being Saul of Tarsus. So the picture we have got is that his family moved to Jerusalem while he was very young. And that the Apostle Paul, even though he's known as Saul of Tarsus, that's where his family was originally from, has spent the vast majority of his life growing up in Jerusalem. And he points out that all of the Jews knew him. In other words, he was not someone who was a stranger. He's not someone who just kind of came out of nowhere and all of a sudden he's at the forefront of things. We understand that from the standpoint of earlier in Acts. When we find him at the stoning of Stephen. And we find that he has been a prominent student of Gamaliel. And so we find that this is a situation where the Apostle Paul is drawing Agrippa's attention to the fact that these people knew his background. These people have known him. They knew that he lived according, as he puts it, according to the strictest sect of the religion. He lived as a Pharisee. Okay. What do you think might be a reason for him to be pointing this out and in these circumstances? I think it's what we've been seeing over and over again. Why did the uprisings keep occurring? Because of jealousy. In other words, he's confirming that he has stayed within the law. He has been obeying the law. He has been a good Jew even up through everything. And one of the things that we have seen is that the Jews have referred to Christianity at this point in time as a sect of what? Judaism. So if you're looking at this from the perspective of these Jews that are accusing him, you have the Pharisees, you have the Sadducees, you have the Zealots, you have the Essenes, and now you have the Christians from the perspective of the Jews. And so he's tying this all together to help King Agrippa understand what's really going on. And I think the Apostle Paul also understands that King Agrippa probably already knows what's going on, because he points out the fact that he's an expert in all of these things, which gives you the understanding that he is familiar with what's been happening. And so the other thing that gives us the understanding that King Agrippa's got the Jewish heritage is the fact that he says in verse 8 there, "Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead?" Notice the connection. He didn't say that one of the gods raised the dead. To you that God raises the dead. In other words, he understands that Agrippa acknowledges that God is God. And so we've got the Apostle Paul laying the groundwork based on King Agrippa's background. I think this is an important lesson for us to understand. And that is, when we are trying to share the gospel with someone, we need to try and share it from the basis of their background. I've talked about this before. We need to share it with them from where they are, not where we would like to suppose they should be. And so it helps to understand what they've been through, what they're dealing with, what they have dealt with, the struggles in their life, so that we can make the connection of the gospel to what they're facing. And in many ways, that's what the Apostle Paul is doing right now. He's making that connection. He is talking about King Agrippa's background, not as king, but as an individual, that Jewish heritage, and the fact that he acknowledges God, and he asks the really blunt question, which is a very valid question, that if you believe God created the universe and created everything around, why would it be so incredible to believe that he raises the dead? I mean, think about it. If he gave life from the very beginning, why can't he give life again? And so it's one of those obvious questions that I'm sure the Sadducees would have to struggle with. You believe he created everything. You believe he created man. You believe he gave man life and all that. Why is it so hard to believe that he raises the dead? We're not given any indication as far as the persuasion of King Agrippa, whether he's Pharisee or Sadducee. All we know is that Paul recognizes he believes in God. He accepts that God is the supreme God. And he asks the question, why would it be thought to be incredible? Why would you think it's incredible that God could raise the dead? As a matter of fact, the way he asks it gives the understanding that it should be pretty much understood that, hey, that's just what God does. I mean, after all, how many times has God said in the Old Testament, is anything too difficult for me? Interesting question. In many ways, that's the same question that the Apostle Paul is asking here. Is anything too difficult for God? If you truly believe He is God, is anything too difficult for Him? And of course, our answer should be, no, there's not anything He can't do. There's nothing that is beyond Him. There's nothing that is too difficult for Him. And that impacts a lot of our worldview, and we don't realize it. Because if nothing is too difficult for God, then we should be able to look around us, and through all of the good and all of the bad that's going on, we should be able to recognize God's hand at work in some way, using it for His purpose, allowing things to happen. And one of the things that people struggle with is this idea of God allowing things to happen. But then the reality comes down to this. God gives us free will for a reason. And free will means that God has to be willing to let evil occur, because without free will, there's no such thing as even love. For instance, I like this illustration that I heard. If someone were to kidnap you and tell you, you are going to love me, you are going to marry me, and we are going to be happy, is that love? Of course not. If you don't have a choice in the matter, it's not actually love. It's manipulated. And in order for there to even be such a thing as love, there has to be that free will. And so as we look around and we see these horrible things that happen, so there's good things that happen as well, but when we see the horrible things that happen, we understand that if God did not allow that free will to exist, we would not be capable of loving Him. And so there is that impact of nothing too difficult for God, that through even the bad things that we see going on, God will work through them, as the Scripture says, for the good of those who love Him, who serve Him. Sometimes it's hard to see the good things coming about. Sometimes those good things don't come about in our lifetime. Sometimes it's on down the road. But the Scriptures have promised us that regardless of what is going on, God will work it for the good of His people. Does it mean His people won't suffer? No. Does it mean that His people won't be persecuted? No. Matter of fact, He told us, you are going to have trouble in this world. You are going to be persecuted. But He will use the good things to our benefit in some way. We may not see it, but He can take the worst of situations, because nothing is too difficult for Him, and bring something good out of it in some way at some point. We may just have to be patient for a while in order to see it. And so the Apostle Paul is basically saying, is anything too difficult for God? Why would you think that it's incredible that God raises the dead? Or why would you think it impossible that God raises the dead if nothing is too difficult for Him? Any thoughts, comments before we move on? Okay. Verse 9. Indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. This I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. Okay. So, we'll pause there for just a moment. Once again, we see the Apostle Paul talking about the zeal and the horrible things he did to Christians, because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And we begin to understand why Paul referred to himself as the worst of sinners. I think if we're honest with ourselves, there may be times that we can even look at our own lives and think, wow, that was just absolutely horrible. And we may even have a tendency to look around at other people and say, well, they're worse than me, but we need to understand it doesn't matter in God's eyes that sinners are sinners. But Paul is laying before Agrippa the extent to what he too was willing to go to. In other words, he's telling Agrippa, they're jealous of what I'm doing, but I used to be just like them. And we understand that Paul was against Christianity, not because he was jealous, but because he just flat out thought it was a heresy. But as we've looked at over and over throughout the book of Acts so far, the Jews were fine with it, even willing to begin accepting it until the Apostle Paul was starting to get more popular than them. And then they got jealous. But the Apostle Paul is telling Agrippa, I used to be just like them. I used to go against everything that Christianity teaches, everything that Christianity stands for. I even was willing to have people put to death. I was a horrible person in the name of God. Think about that. That's basically what he was saying. I was using the name of God as the reason for me to be a horrible person. I mean, think about this. Many places throughout the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, even Peter and John dealt with the issue of heresies. But at any point did they ever tell them, what you need to do to get rid of the heresy is kill them? Never did they? But that was the Jewish method of doing things. Get rid of the heresy by executing them and not even willing to listen to the evidence. See, that's the incredible thing, because they've had all the evidence. If they understood fully what the prophets had to say, it was all laid out. Everything that took place, including how Jesus was to be executed, where he was to be buried, and what would happen. It's all there. And even though they saw all of these events take place, all of these prophecies fulfilled one after the other, they didn't make the connection. Not even the Apostle Paul, until Christ appeared to him on the road. And so he's saying, I was just like them. I was willing to have people put to death because I didn't agree with them. That's really what it comes down to. I was willing to have people put to death because I didn't agree with them. That's interesting. He didn't agree with the Sadducees. Didn't agree with the Essenes. Didn't agree with the Zealots. Didn't try to have them put to death. Only the sect known as the Christians, the followers of the way. And so even in that zeal, there is that inconsistency, that hypocrisy of the position of who were willing to have put to death and who were not. And so he is laying out as a part of his defense the fact that he used to be like them. It's an interesting defense. Think about it. He's admitting to being guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. That's an interesting thought. He is admitting to having innocent people put in prison. I don't know about you, that sounds kind of like a wild defense to me, wild position to be in. But when you understand it's already been determined, the accusations being leveled against you are not ones that merit you being in prison, that do not merit you being executed, then you can be a little bit more honest about everything going on. And in order to share the gospel with King Agrippa, what the Apostle Paul is trying to do is help him see the change that's taking place, the transforming power of Jesus Christ. That idea of what we once were to what we are now. Something that I think all too often we as Christians today fail to recognize. We have a tendency to forget that without Christ, we were just as lost as any other non-Christian, regardless of what they had done or not done. We are just as lost as any murderer in prison. We are just as lost as any thief in prison. We're just as lost as any rapist. Without Christ, we were lost, period. And so what the Apostle Paul is trying to impress upon King Agrippa is the transforming power of Jesus Christ. How he can take someone who has been just an absolutely horrible person, turn them into a 180 degree and make them completely someone different. Another prime example, the Apostle John. He and his brother James, they were known as the Sons of Thunder. That's why Jesus nicknamed them, Sons of Thunder. Do you remember why? Because they wanted to call down fire and brimstone on everybody. But then you get to know John as being the apostle of love as you read through his letters. The transforming power of Jesus Christ. And the fact that when you look at the lives of the apostles, not one of them was the same after they started following Christ. I mean, think about it. I mean, one of them that was amongst the apostles, Simon the Zealot. Remember the Zealots? We've talked about them. They've been talking about them now. Who are they? They're the ones who are on board for getting rid of the Romans in any way possible, including ambushing them, murdering them, doing whatever you had to do. And all of a sudden we've got one of these guys transformed by the power of Jesus Christ. And so Paul's message to King Agrippa is about the transforming power of God. Nothing's too difficult for God. Why should you think it's incredible He can raise the dead? Let me tell you how He transformed me. Let me explain to you the power He showed in my life. This is what I was. These are the things I did in His name. Even though I didn't realize they were completely wrong, I did them in His name. Thinking that I was bringing Him glory. Thinking that I was serving Him. I mean, most of us are familiar with different, quote, preachers and so on in the world today and down through the years who've done things in the name of Jesus that, you know, we look at them like, you've got to be kidding me. The number of people that will do incredibly horrible things in the name of religion. You know, we like to point to like Islam and things like that, but guess what? People in Christianity are not exempt either. It's happened down through the centuries, down through the years. And the Apostle Paul is saying, I was one of them. I did those kinds of things. I was an absolutely horrible person in the name of religion, in the name of God. And I was willing to do anything I possibly could to stop this from happening, to stop this from spreading, to stop this from growing. Even though early on, Gamaliel had stood up in the council and said, you know, if this is of God, you can't stop it. The best thing to do is let it go, and if it's not of God, it'll fizzle out on its own. Interesting. Who was Gamaliel to Paul? He was his teacher. And Paul has made his connection to Gamaliel a part of his defense at many times because of the Gamaliel's standing in the council. The amount of respect he commanded. But then we find the student ignoring the teacher. Any thoughts, comments? Because I think we're going to end there for today, and then next week we will get into the changed Paul. We'll pick up next week at verse 12 in chapter 26. Now, I love how Scripture lets us see these people as real people, not as somebody that's been embellished to look good, but we get to see them as they are, the real person, because it helps us really begin to understand just the transforming power of God is so incredible.